The sky over St. Jude's Basin had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the $500 million super yacht, the Sovereign, was nothing more than a glittering, helpless toy bobbing in the center of a rising gale. Julian Vane, the billionaire CEO whose face had graced every major financial magazine for a decade, was currently clutching a gold-plated railing and screaming into a distress radio, his voice cracking with a raw terror that no amount of offshore capital could fix. The yacht's state-of-the-art propulsion system had gone inexplicably silent, leaving the massive vessel drifting dangerously toward the jagged, foam-covered teeth of the Widow's Reef, while the elite crew scrambled in a panic that bordered on total mutiny. Then, through the crackle of the static and the roar of the Atlantic, a voice cut through the chaos, not hurried, not frightened, but cold and steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through a fog. "This is Silas Vance," the voice crackled over the emergency frequency, vibrating with a quiet authority that silenced the screams on the bridge. "You're in my water now, Julian, and I don't remember giving you permission to park in my harbor." Julian froze, his knuckles white as he recognized the voice of the man he'd humiliated and thrown off his deck only 48 hours prior.
He realized too late that the salt-stained peasant he'd treated like human debris was now the only person on the planet who could keep his $500 million legacy from becoming a pile of scrap metal. Everyone in the bay had spent years looking down at Silas as a simple dockhand, but they were about to learn that Silas didn't just work at the port, he owned the very tide that was currently pulling them under. 48 hours earlier, the sun had been shimmering off the pristine teak decks of the Sovereign. But for Silas Vance, the warmth was eclipsed by the cold arrogance of the men who walked them. He was kneeling by a recessed access hatch near the stern, his 8-year-old daughter Maya standing quietly beside him, holding a specialized ultrasonic flow meter, her eyes wide as she took in the world of excess she'd only ever seen from the shore. Silas, dressed in a rugged canvas work vest reinforced with carbon fiber patches and grease-stained cargo pants, was a sharp, jagged contrast to the sea of Italian cashmere, white linen, and chilled caviar that defined Julian Vane's midday gala. As Silas adjusted a high-precision sensor, Julian stepped through the crowd of models and sycophants, his designer loafers clicking rhythmically against the wood, until he reached Silas's modular, high-tensile steel toolbox. Without a word, Julian delivered a sharp, dismissive kick to the polymer casing, sending a set of precision-machined wrenches skittering across the deck like common trash. "I pay for excellence, not for a salt-stained scavenger to bring his rust and his baggage onto my sanctuary," Julian barked, his voice dripping with a calculated cruelty that drew a ripple of mocking laughter from the surrounding elites. He looked down at Silas, a man whose hands were a map of scars and maritime wisdom, and then at Maya, sneering as if the very presence of a child in a faded t-shirt was a stain on his $500 million investment. Silas didn't retaliate or shout. He simply stood up with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes locking onto the cavitation signatures already vibrating through the yacht's hull, a technical death sentence Julian was too arrogant to hear. "The sensor is failing because your azopod's galvanic isolation is breached, Mr. Vane," Silas said calmly, his voice a low rumble of canvas and carbon fiber authority. But Julian didn't want the truth. He wanted a victim. He signaled his security team to seize Silas's equipment and ordered them to be dumped at a remote, rickety supply dock 3 miles down the coast, a rotting pier that smelled of dead fish and failure, literally throwing the only man who could save his ship into the mud, while the cashmere and caviar crowd toasted to his departure. The rain came down in relentless, vertical sheets as Silas and Maya trudged along the jagged coastline road, their boots squelching in the mud that Julian Vane had deemed their natural habitat. Maya clutched her backpack tightly, her small shoulders hunched against the wind, but she didn't complain. She had inherited her father's ironclad stoicism, a trait forged by years of living on the edge of the Atlantic's cold indifference. When they finally reached their cottage, a weathered, cedar-shingled structure that smelled of salt air, old parchment, and ozone, Silas didn't head for the kitchen or the heater. He went straight to the small, illuminated workbench in the corner of the living room. Maya carefully pulled out her lucky lighthouse lamp, a delicate brass and glass miniature that had been a gift from her mother, Clara, a brilliant maritime lawyer who had spent her life defending the rights of sailors before she passed away. The lamp's internal housing had been jarred loose when Vane's security team had tossed their gear onto the rotting supply dock, and Maya's eyes were misty as she handed the damaged heirloom to her father. Silas didn't say a word. He simply clicked on his magnifying loupe and pulled out a precision, temperature-controlled soldering iron, his hands becoming as still and focused as a master surgeon's.
He cleaned the tip with a damp sponge, the sharp hiss of steam the only sound in the room, and began to fuse the delicate copper strands back to the circuit board with an accuracy that belied his rough, calloused exterior. As the tiny LED inside the lighthouse flickered back to life, casting a warm, rotating amber beam across the room, Silas looked at his daughter and spoke in a low, gravelly tone that carried the weight of a life lived at sea. "Don't let the noise of men like Vane rattle your hull, Maya," he said, his eyes reflecting the miniature beacon. "They think they can shout over the wind because they have a megaphone, but never forget what I taught you. The loudest engine in the harbor is usually the one with a cracked block." He patted her hand and stood up, his gaze momentarily drifting to a thick, nondescript manila folder resting on his desk under a stack of weathered nautical charts. The tab on the folder didn't say maintenance or labor. It was stamped with a high-end legal seal entitled St. Jude Port Authority, Final Asset Acquisition and Infrastructure Takeover Strategy. As Silas was being forcibly escorted toward the rusted tender boat by Vane's security, his gaze had dropped below the shimmering waterline of the Sovereign, focusing with the clinical intensity of a man who had spent 30 years studying the hidden violence of the sea. While Julian was busy celebrating his own perceived dominance, Silas had seen the white bloom of oxidation and the jagged, microscopic pitting around the bronze alloy housing of the yacht's massive azipod propulsion system, a textbook signature of severe stray current electrolysis. To a layman, it looked like a few spots of sea salt, but to Silas, it was the unmistakable evidence of galvanic corrosion, where the ship's own electrical system was leaching ions directly into the high salinity water of the basin, effectively turning the hull into a giant dissolving battery. The Billionaire's insistence on running high-wattage decorative lighting and massive onboard servers while at anchor had created a cascading failure in the sacrificial anodes, and the resulting azipod cavitation was already beginning to chew through the drive shafts with every rotation. Silas knew that within 48 hours, the structural integrity of the seals would vanish, the cooling pumps would choke on brine, and the $500 million vessel would be nothing more than a drifting, powerless slab of steel at the mercy of the Atlantic's currents. He had reached for his ultrasonic flow meter one last time, intending to show Vane the proof of the impending disaster, but the memory of the Billionaire's boot against his toolbox stayed his hand. He realized that a man who refuses to listen to the whisper of the machine deserves to hear the scream of its failure. Silas didn't say a word as he stepped onto the rickety tender. He simply adjusted his cap, held Maya close, and watched from the shore as the majestic white ship sailed toward its own inevitable, silent destruction, counting down the seconds until the ocean claimed its due. The morning light was a cold slate. A man in a suit that cost more than Silas's tugboat stepped out and pinned a bright red notice of foreclosure to the workshop door, the staple gun crack echoing like a final judgment against the lapping waves. Julian Vane wasn't just content with humiliating Silas at sea, he was using the corporate machinery of Apex Global to systematically starve Silas's small salvage company, squeezing his credit lines and manipulating the local zoning boards to declare his pier a navigational hazard. The notice claimed that Silas had 48 hours to vacate the premises or face the forcible seizure of his equipment, a move designed to strip him of his livelihood before he could even mount a legal defense. Maya stood in the doorway of the cottage,
her eyes fixed on the red paper fluttering in the wind, her voice trembling as she asked if they were going to lose their home to the man from the yacht. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the sedan as it kicked up dust and drove away. He simply reached out and smoothed the edges of the notice with a steady thumb, his expression unreadable as he turned to his daughter. Apex Global thinks they own the shoreline because they bought the paper it's written on, Maya, he said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm of their uncertainty.
But the ocean doesn't care about deeds, and it doesn't care about billionaires. You don't fight a riptide by swimming against it. You wait for the moment it loses its strength, and then you make your move. Remember what I told you. The tide always turns for those who know how to wait. He walked back into the workshop, past the foreclosure sign, and sat down at his desk. He didn't pick up a phone to beg for a loan. He picked up the Port Authority acquisition folder and began to cross-reference the secret debt load of the very harbor Apex Global was trying to steal. Julian Vane stood on the upper deck of the Sovereign, the air around him thick with the smell of expensive ozone and the self-congratulatory chatter of the global tech summit he had convened to showcase his dominance over the digital and physical worlds. In a move that sent shockwaves through the local maritime union, Julian had ceremoniously fired the veteran harbor master, Old Man Holloway, a man with 40 years of title knowledge, and replaced the entire port's management staff with a proprietary Apex Nexus AI docking system. Julian boasted to a circle of fawning venture capitalists that human intuition was a deprecated legacy system, claiming his new algorithm could calculate berthing trajectories with a precision that made old sailors obsolete.
He ignored the frantic warnings about the aging infrastructure of Deepwater Berth 4, specifically the concrete spalling and piling rot that had plagued the pier since the last major hurricane, dismissing the data as mere maintenance noise intended to pad local budgets. With the arrogance of a man who believed he could code the weather, he ordered the $500 million yacht to be moored directly against the most vulnerable section of the quay, perfectly positioned for the cameras, but dangerously exposed to the Devil's Eddy, a unique subsurface reverse current that only the fired harbor master knew how to compensate for. Julian's chrome and glass mentality refused to acknowledge the rust and rebar reality beneath the waterline, viewing the physical world as something that would eventually yield to his sheer force of will and a high-speed fiber connection. As the sun set, the AI system began its first efficiency cycle, tightening the massive carbon fiber mooring lines to a tension that the decaying pilings were never designed to hold, while Julian toasted to a future where men like Silas Vance were nothing more than a footnote in a digital ledger.
The exterior of Silas's workshop was a masterclass in strategic camouflage, appearing to any passing corporate spy as a derelict, salt-rotted boat shed. But inside, the scent of brine and cedar was replaced by the ionized hum of liquid-cooled server racks and encrypted satellite terminals. This was Silas's true engine room, a high-frequency trading and maritime logistics hub that allowed him to monitor every knot of current and every cent of shipping debt in the Atlantic basin with the cold precision of a predator. While Julian Vane was busy performing for the cameras on his yacht, Silas was buried in the admiralty law codes of the 18th century, navigating the complex web of maritime lien priorities and leasehold interests that Julian's legal team had arrogantly overlooked in their rush to modernize. He sat before a wall of glowing monitors, his face illuminated by the flickering data of 100 shell companies, executing a series of reverse triangular mergers that were quietly collapsing the debt of the St. Jude Port Authority into a single private entity controlled by the Vance Maritime Trust. Silas tapped into the hidden Blackwater salvage fortune he had spent 20 years building, wealth pulled from the forgotten wrecks of the deep, and combined it with the asset-backed trust his late wife Clara had meticulously constructed before her death. He wasn't just buying a pier. He was utilizing the rule of Oleron and the doctrine of general average to trigger a total infrastructure takeover, leveraging the very bottomry bonds that the city had used to fund the port's crumbling expansion. As the clock struck midnight, his finger hovered over the execute key,
his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of a final, irrevocable transaction that bypassed the local boards Julian had corrupted. With a single heavy click, the legal ownership of every bollard, every crane, and every cubic meter of water in the St. Jude Basin shifted into his hands. Silas leaned back, the silence of the workshop punctuated only by the distant, mournful cry of a buoy out in the dark water, knowing that the trap was finally set. Julian Vane thought he was buying a neighborhood, but he didn't realize he was currently floating on a liquid asset that now belonged entirely to the man he had left in the mud.
The atmosphere inside the Anchor's Rest diner was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the heavy weight of local judgment. Silas sat at his usual corner stool, his hands, scarred by years of hauling cables, wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug as he stared out the window at the morning fog. The door chimes jangled aggressively as Buck Miller, the town's most prominent real estate mogul, and a man who had recently sold his soul and half the waterfront to Julian Vane, walked in with a group of fawning investors. Buck spotted Silas immediately, and a predatory grin spread across his face, the kind of smile used by a man who thinks he's already won. "Well, if it isn't the ghost of St. Jude's Basin," Buck shouted, his voice booming off the linoleum walls so everyone from the cook to the tourists could hear. "I saw that red notice on your pier this morning, Silas. It's over. You're a has-been in a world that's moving at fiber optic speed. If I were you, I'd pack up that little cottage before Vane turns it into a high-end jet ski rental and puts a souvenir shop where your workshop used to be." The diners went silent, some looking away in pity, while others, those who had already been bought by Vane's promises, smirked into their coffee. Silas sat in the shadows of his workshop, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a final, official transmission that he knew would be ignored. He wasn't acting out of kindness or a lingering sense of loyalty. He was acting out of navigational due diligence, a strict requirement under the International Maritime Association's safety protocols that would protect his legal standing when the inevitable collapse occurred. He hit the send command on a document titled Notice of Navigational Hazard and Imminent Propulsion Failure, routing it directly through the port's newly privatized automatic identification system, a channel he now controlled with absolute authority. On the sun-drenched bridge of the Sovereign, the notification chimed on Julian Vane's custom gold-encased iPad, interrupting a high-stakes pitch he was making to a group of venture capitalists. Julian looked at the screen, saw the digital signature of the St. Jude Port Authority, which he still assumed was staffed by the same peasants he had cowed into submission, and let out a bark of laughter that echoed through the marble-floored lounge. "Look at this," Julian announced to the room, turning the screen so his guests could see the official-looking warning.
Our little dockhand, Silas, has apparently hacked into the port system to send me hazard notices from his rotting shack. He's so desperate for attention, he's pretending to be the harbor master. To the delight of his fawning audience, Julian hit the screen record button to capture a video for his 3 million social media followers, a digital trophy of his arrogance. "Hey guys, just got a message from a jealous peasant playing at being a captain." Julian sneered into the camera, his thumb hovering over the red delete icon. "This is what happens when you don't keep up with the times. You spend your days shouting at the clouds while the world sails past you. Silas, buddy, thanks for the expert advice, but I've got an AI that's smarter than your entire family tree combined." With a theatrical flourish, Julian swiped the notice into the digital trash and hit empty bin, the sound of crumpled paper being the only warning he'd receive before the galvanic corrosion he'd been warned about reached its breaking point. The investors roared with laughter, toast after toast being made to the end of the analog age, completely oblivious to the fact that Julian had just recorded a confession of gross negligence that would be used to dismantle his empire in less than 24 hours.
The Global Tech Summit reached its crescendo just as the horizon began to bleed into a violent, churning gray, the air on the deck of the Sovereign thick with the electric tension of a world about to break. Inside the climate-controlled Grand Salon, the elite were busy projecting holographic growth charts, completely unaware that the physical world was already reclaiming its territory.
Deep in the bowels of the yacht, the galvanic corrosion Silas had warned about finally reached the critical threshold. The high salinity brine had breached the softened seals of the azopod housing, triggering an immediate thermal runaway in the cooling pumps. High temperature alarms began to scream across the bridge, but the Apex Nexus AI, programmed for efficiency over resiliency, interpreted the surge as a sensor glitch and attempted to overclock the starboard drive to compensate. Simultaneously, the king tide surged into the basin, colliding with the gale-force winds to create a rare standing wave that the AI's algorithms dismissed as a statistical outlier. Julian Vane stood on the bridge, his face pale as he watched the digital interface flicker and turn red, the AI's voice calmly announcing environmental variable error, just as the entire ship's power grid shuddered and died.
Silas stood at the absolute edge of his private pier, his boots planted firmly on the wet, vibrating boards, as he watched a crimson distress flare arc into the black, rain-streaked sky over the basin. The Sovereign was a ghost in the distance, its once proud silhouette tilting dangerously as it was swallowed by the storm's mounting fury. Maya stood beside him, her small hand clutching his waterproof coat, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind as she asked the question he had been dreading. "Dad, they're going to hit the rocks. Are we just going to watch?" Silas looked down at his daughter, then back at the dying light on the horizon, the memory of Julian Vane's voice still echoing in the salt spray. He could still see the billionaire's designer loafer kicking his precision tools, and most painfully, he remembered the sneer on Vane's face when he had mentioned Clara's maritime work, calling her a bottom-feeding lawyer for losers. Every instinct of the quiet professional screamed that Julian had earned this catastrophe, that the sea was simply delivering a long-overdue invoice for his unearned arrogance.
To save him now felt like a betrayal of the humiliation they had endured, and an insult to the memory of the woman who had spent her life fighting for the truth. But as his gaze fell upon the lucky lighthouse Maya had brought out onto the porch, its amber light still spinning true despite the chaos of the gale, Silas remembered the creed his wife had lived by. You don't save people because they are good. You save them because you are. He realized that the 24 crew members on that ship, the cooks, the deckhands, the engineers, were men and women with families, people who were currently being sacrificed for one man's hubris. Silas's eyes hardened, the moral conflict vanishing into a cold, tactical resolve. He wasn't doing this for the man who had kicked him off the deck. He was doing it for the code of the sea that had defined his family for generations. He turned to Maya, squeezed her shoulder, and headed for the heavy steel door of his high-torque tugboat, the Vance Resolve. The peasant was about to show the CEO what real power looked like when the tide stopped playing games. Silas didn't hesitate. He punched a 12-digit sequence into his encrypted terminal, activating the St. Jude Port God Mode override that he had secured during his midnight acquisition. Immediately, the lights across the entire harbor flared into a piercing emergency amber, and the automated sirens began a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the very hull of the Vance Resolve. This tugboat wasn't built for cocktail parties or sunset cruises. It was a battle-hardened beast of reinforced steel and twin 8,000-horsepower diesel engines, specifically designed for bollard pull maneuvers that could exert more sheer force than the Atlantic Ocean could generate in a rage. Silas fired the ignition, the guttural roar of the engines drowning out the storm as he throttled up, the Resolve cutting into the 15-foot swells with a violent, surgical precision that made the $500 million yacht look like a piece of drifting driftwood. On the bridge of the Sovereign, the elite crew, men with pristine uniforms and degrees from maritime academies, but 0 hours in a true North Atlantic gale, were paralyzed in a theater of total unadulterated chaos, their expensive glass consoles flickering with critical system failure warnings while they fought over life jackets and screamed into dead radios. Silas, meanwhile, was a statue of pure, cold competence.
his weathered hands dancing across the analog throttles and the joystick for the ASD azimuthing stern drives, performing a vector-controlled approach that defied the conventional laws of nautical physics. He didn't need an AI algorithm to tell him the boat's limits. He used the seaman's feel, sensing the torque on the hull and the lethal pull of the Devil's Eddy through the vibration in his boots and the tension in the steering. He navigated the Dead Man's Channel, a passage so narrow that the hull of the Resolve was only inches away from the jagged, foam-covered rocks, using the Bernoulli effect of the rushing current to whip his boat into a perfect 90-degree pivot that placed him directly in the path of the drifting giant. While Julian Vane was clutching a bottle of 30-year-old scotch and weeping in his cabin, Silas was executing a high-tension snatch recovery, firing a pneumatic line thrower with the accuracy of a sniper, the heavy messenger line soaring through the 90-knot gale to bridge the gap between his salt-stained reality and the billionaire's failing dream.
He wasn't just piloting a boat. He was conducting an orchestra of raw power and mechanical wisdom, moving with a fluid, terrifying efficiency that made every innovative system on the yacht look like a broken toy. As the 6-inch thick synthetic tow cable went taut with a sound like a thunderclap, Silas felt the massive, drifting weight of the ship transfer into his palms, and for the first time in 10 years, the ghost of the basin was exactly where he belonged. The tow cable hissed under the immense strain, vibrating like a lethal piano wire between the two vessels, as Silas brought the Vance Resolve to a dead, idling hover just 50 yards from the jagged white foam of the reef. Julian Vane, his designer clothes drenched in salt and his face pale with a desperate, frantic energy, leaned over the shattered railing of the yacht's bridge and screamed through a handheld megaphone, his voice cracking against the wind. "What are you waiting for, you idiot? Pull us in! Do the job you were hired for and get this ship to the dock before the hull splits! I'll pay you 10 times your salvage rate, just move this boat now!" Silas didn't touch the throttle. Instead, he keyed the external bridge speakers, his voice booming over the roar of the gale with a calm, resonant weight that made the billionaire's screaming sound like a child's tantrum. You knew all these things a long time ago. Now, who would you rather face the ocean with? The ghost of the basin or a broken toy?
Julian, you haven't paid me a cent in 10 years, and you aren't about to start now, Silas said, his gaze fixed on the glowing monitors of his terminal. You should have spent less time recording videos of yourself deleting my warnings and more time reading the fine print of the harbor's debt restructuring clauses. I'm not your dockhand, Julian. As of 0400 hours this morning, I am the majority shareholder and chief executive of the St. Jude Port Authority, which means you are currently trespassing in my private waters without a valid berthing contract. Silas reached for his tablet, and with a single command, he projected the yacht's legal status onto the harbor's massive LED navigation board, the red text visible for miles. According to the automated audit of the very AI system you insisted on, the Sovereign has been operating with a material breach in its insurance indemnity because your hull depth exceeds the safety profile of the storm surge. Furthermore, your parent company, Apex Global, is currently 45 days delinquent on its wharfage and demurrage fees for the equipment you left on my pier. Silas watched the megaphone slip from Julian's hand as he delivered the final blow. I've just executed a writ of attachment under the Admiralty Court's emergency jurisdiction. Your yacht is officially under a seizure warrant for unpaid debts. You aren't my client, Julian. You are my collateral, and until I sign the release, you aren't moving an inch.